Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast Microscope by Telescope Advisors. Today's guest is entrepreneur Mark Fleming Jr., a founder who's built his company, Signature Closers, from what began as a college side hustle into a $65 million a year real estate services and technology company before successfully selling it to Fortune 800 company Stewart Title in 2021. Since then, Mark has continued building and investing through MEMM Capital, advising startups, and co-founding new ventures like TalentShare. He's also launching a platform called The Arena, alongside a new book focused on the lessons he learned scaling and exiting businesses. Mark, welcome to the show.
Yeah, appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So let's start with kind of your origin story, your hero story, your background. From what I've gathered in our conversations, you started Signature Closers from what was essentially a college job and then grew it into a booming company, over $65 million a year in annual revenue before it was sold to Stewart Title. Looking back, what were the key decisions or inflection points that allowed you to scale that business so dramatically?
That's a good question. Appreciate the intro and all the kudos as far as the accolades and things like that. Obviously, a big part of that was our team and being able to grow to that volume. Want to shout out to them first and foremost and, thank them for the work they put in. But I would say, in terms of inflection points, there were a few. Initially, I started the business, as you mentioned, kind of a side business. So I was at Miami University in Oxford, became a notary myself and, took on closings or real estate transactions that no one else wanted to do. So for those that may be listening or viewing that don't really know a lot about the real estate world, when you have a real estate transaction, typically, there might be an attorney, but there's a notary usually. So when you're signing paperwork, a notary is there to verify your signatures, make sure you are who you say you are. And essentially that was my role. So I became a notary and I was going to real estate closings that no one else wanted to do in the middle of nowhere, farmhouse in Oxford, Ohio, 9 p.m. And, kind of learned that way. And that was really my entry into the industry. Kind of the first inflection point really was when I graduated from school. I was majoring in finance and went to work for Cardinal Health. And at that point, it was like, all right, I had this nice full-time business and it was ready to be done. But I had built a small network of people across Ohio. And at that time, in real estate closings, people were paying someone, let's say you had a real estate closing in Cleveland and you were based in Columbus. Somebody would pay, a notary or someone in their office to drive from Columbus, get the paperwork signed in Cleveland and bring it back. And so the idea of mobile notaries was just sort of becoming in vogue. And it just so happened that I had me connected to it. I don't even remember how. And so it sort of evolved, and that was an inflection point where we said, okay, I have this business now, essentially. It's a side business and kind of sit in between the title company clients and the lenders and this small panel of notaries. So that was kind of the first inflection point. The second was probably when I made the leap to a full-time business. So for about 4 or 5 years, I had a partner that eventually kind of went behind my back. So my mother-in-law stepped in at that point and was kind of the point of contact for the business. And I was mostly relationships and billing, paying our notaries and billing our customers, collecting payment. And it got to a point where it was like pretty overwhelming with my full-time work. So I figured out really quickly at Cardinal Health, a big company wasn't for me. Got into the world of employee benefits, and that was kind of my full-time jam for about 4 or 5 years. Ended up going to work for a company in Cincinnati. We thought we were going to move down there that I was helping sell business process automation software. So just a couple of different things that were kind of my full-time focus. And in the meantime, I had Signature as this background job. I was ready to be done, had a young family, young kids. And that's when I met Chris, who ended up being my technical co-founder down in Cincinnati. We kind of laugh about the story today, but it was like, I still, again, I think I told somebody earlier today, I don't know how he knew about my business or what we were doing. He's like, I heard you have this little side business center. Why don't we just go to lunch? So we literally went to BW3's Blue Ash down in Cincinnati, jotted some things on a napkin. I told him my headaches, my problems. I was like, I'm ready to be done with this side business. He's like, well, let me just build a website and, let's see what happens. If it works, cool. I grow into the business. If not, I'm done. No big deal. Like, I won't charge anything, whatever. I'm like, all right, cool. So, obviously that was a big inflection point to make that leap. And then shortly thereafter, we ended up getting a large national customer that kind of came out of nowhere. Basically, they did send us the business they said they were going to send, which was surprising at that time. We were doing 100 signings a month. They added 900. So
Wow.
I made the leap full time March of 2012. And, there were a few other inflection points along the way. I don't get too long-winded of an answer. An audit or an RFP that we did for a publicly traded company, deciding to launch our own technology to compete with a company called SnapDocs, and then ultimately deciding to sell. Those are kind of the big ones that stand out. But, there was definitely, 20 different things that occurred in the journey that I could say, well, if I decided this differently or if we made a different choice, who knows where we would have been. So it's hard to say, but I would say those are kind of the big 4 or 5 that stand out.
What happened when you got that big national contract and you went from 100 signings a month to 900 signings a month. Was that like an oh shit moment where like, was that like exciting and scary at the same time? Like how did you do that?
Yeah, very perceptive, 100%.
I'm like
It,
thinking about, wow, oh my gosh, how do you do it?
Well, I think the challenging part in our industry, and you know this probably more than anybody, we've evolved a lot in the last 15 or 20 years in terms of
Hmm.
compliance, technology. It's still a fairly antiquated industry in some ways. But back then, the way that we would receive orders, a title company would go into our platform, or I'm sorry, not at this point. They wouldn't even go into our platform. They'd send us an email and it would be
Yeah.
like date, time, location, whatever other details we needed. We would then take that information, rekey it in our platform. They would email us, not securely, PDF documents, which is crazy that that was happening. We would take those, we'd put them in our system. Everything was manual. So to go from 100 of those a month to 1,000,
Hmm.
10 times overnight, and it didn't happen quite overnight, but it happened fairly quickly. It was pretty chaotic. So yes, it was exciting, but also like got to a point where I think it was maybe October of that year, this customer came along in this was 2011 before I made the
Okay.
leap full time. November, December, like I distinctly remember around the holidays, a lot of family time being like, oh my gosh, like I had a full time job still. After hours, I'm like rekeying these orders, calling, picking up the phone, calling notaries. So it was chaos for a while. And actually, that sort of drove not only the decision to jump full time, but the
Hmm.
first customer that we brought on a national scope was integrated or was using Resware. And so Chris, my technical co-founder, had a Resware, and we both liked the idea of lean, Six Sigma, business
Yeah.
process automation. That's sort of like how we built our business. And that was sort of their focus. And so we were like, oh, it's interesting. We looked at software, we looked at Resware. We ended up integrating our technology with Resware. And we were the first company in the country to do that in our space, in our little niche industry.
Hmm.
And it was kind of survival for one, because that big customer was using Resware. So that allowed them to basically place an order. It showed up in our system, push us docs securely. And we expanded upon that over the years. But that is a really good example of another inflection point, because it turned out that a lot of the largest national title companies ended up using Resware. And by building that relationship before anyone else, like we maintained, I think, an advantage in regards to our integration, as well as like just the relationships. But yeah, it was chaotic to say the least until we got to that.
Yeah. I think like as a founder, this is something that I'm dealing with my business is the opportunity to scale is there, but there's this push and pull, right? Where you want to be able to fulfill the work well. And until you have the business, it's hard to staff for, the anticipated business. And staff is part of it, not the only piece, obviously, but just
Sure.
thinking about even how you built out a stable of notaries that was extensive enough to go from 100 to 900. There's probably a little bit of risk involved reputationally there. And it's a huge company, right? Like it's a national company. And I'm glad that you took the leap. It worked out. I mean, you have experienced what many entrepreneurs aspire to, building that company from scratch as a recent college grad to ultimately selling it to a Fortune 800 organization. Let's talk next about what that exit process taught you about building a company that's actually saleable versus just maybe profitable.
That's a great question. And yeah, I was very blessed and fortunate that we were able to have the exit we had. I mean, it was, I call them God winks, fate, all these little moments that happened along the way. And I know we'll talk a little bit later about like a book I just launched, but one of the stories in the book I'll kind of, allude to, I guess, before we get there. This was like 2016, one of the original Resware user group conferences. I had gone out to Colorado, and I have, historically had some neck and back issues, and I had some flare up going on. I ended up throwing out my lower back. I was like really struggling, and I had a meeting lined up in St. Louis
Hmm.
on the way back from Denver, and it was to meet with Stewart Title Company. And this was a company I was trying to open the door to. And if you're familiar with our industry, there's kind of a big four underwriters that publicly traded and were big companies. So you have, Stewart, Fidelity, First American, and Old Republic. And I haven't been able to crack. I finally got this meeting. And I'm like, I'm dying. I need to cancel. I need to not go. But I ended up going. And, go through the meeting. They're great people. They're like, we have other vendors. So you'll be among others. You'll kind of be mixed in. And, truth be told, we really never did land a ton of business for them. So, in the moment, it felt like a big disappointment. But then fast forward, 4 years, Stewart ends up buying our company, right? So there's like all these moments along the way where things happened for a reason. I feel like it played out in a
Hmm.
way that if they hadn't happened, it wouldn't have gone in the same way. So as it relates to the sale of business, I think it kind of to tie that back to the original question, I think a lot of those decisions and things that happened, whether it was in our industry, whether it was COVID, for example, driving interest rates down and blowing up volume, like we were already on a trajectory to grow. So we were a solid, stable business from 2012 to 2018. Grew, we doubled in 2019 pre-COVID, and then we were trending to probably maybe double, give or take again. Ended up tripling instead in 2020, and then after the sale ended up, doubling again. So there was just a tremendous amount of growth, but all these things sort of aligned. And I wasn't really looking to sell. Like we had our first conversations maybe in 2018. There was a company, and I don't know if I'm outside my NDAs or not. So I'll be careful about saying what who and what and whatnot. Company reached out that was owned by a private equity group. The private equity group reached out of Philadelphia, and we were too small in 2018. In 2019, we talked to a company that was a national title company owned by private equity. Again, kind of too
Mm-hmm.
small. And that was fun. Like we were okay with that. We weren't really looking to sell. It was just like, oh, I'm curious. Let's have some conversations. And as 2020 started to happen, I saw what was happening with COVID. I saw what was happening with remote online notary.
Mm-hmm.
And Stewart actually was going through a process in it was 2016. They were trying Fidelity and Stewart were going to do a merger, and the New York it's insurance department or attorney general or somebody didn't like the merger.
Mm-hmm.
So, Stewart had a turnover in leadership. And I had known all along Stewart was one of the four companies, the big four, that didn't have what we do in-house already. And so I started to get a lot of inbound interest from companies, platforms and technology and other people that are like, hey, you've built this business to the point where it's probably the largest in the country with like this notary piece.
Mm-hmm.
And as that interest came in, I actually reached out to Stewart and was like, I have no idea if you're interested, but we're not like actively out there selling, but we'd love to have a conversation. And if that's something you're interested in. And unbeknownst to me, they were, I think, either in LOI or very close with a company called Notary Cam, which is like an online digital technology platform for notaries. And it was just like kind of the perfect time and the perfect way to like segue and all of that. So kind
Mm-hmm.
of happened unexpectedly as far as like, the journey. It wasn't like I set out and said, probably like I should have said, what's our goal? How are we trying to get, where are we trying to get to? What's our exit strategy? I think over the last 2 or 3 years I owned the company, we started to like think that way, but there was no formal, okay, we're trying to sell. It was like all of a sudden we had this inbound interest and, it started some conversations and the stability of Stewart as well as the company themselves, the offer, everything just kind of fell into place. So it was kind of a wild whirlwind of a ride, like between I think we started our conversations July maybe, and then ended up closing later, early 2021 is when we actually sold the company. So wild experience.
I think there's like a freedom in that though. There's a freedom in that you built the business, your first business out of college, you built in a way that was just like free and right. And you followed your instincts and what you knew about the business and you kept, moving forward, growing. And there are so many founders who start with the end in mind in that they're always thinking about exit strategy. And then they start to grip it a little too tight, right? Like we know these people. And what happens when you grip it too tight oftentimes is you get like that sales breath and it becomes like the goal is further and further away. So like instead of chasing that intention, it sounds like you guys built the foundation for something as the primary focus.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the way that we looked at our business and the decisions that we made, we had a systemic way of going about it. I think that in hindsight, and that's part of what I reflected on in the book is, how did we make the decisions we made? And if I were to tell another business owner how to go through that same process as they're thinking
Mm-hmm.
about it, what would that look like? And for us, the biggest lens we used initially and probably all the way through was, does this drive revenue? Does
Uh-huh.
this reduce cost? And does this create a better experience for our customers? I will say that I think our business was most successful when we were focused on essentially creating like the best version of ourselves that we could be. And a lot of that was related to customer feedback. It was, leaning into our customers and having conversations and understanding their needs and then building for those problems, as opposed to, well, we're going to try to hit this revenue number and this financial metric. I think, it comes back to focus on the outcome or focus on the journey. And I think when you build a methodology that's journey focused, that's really a key. Like I know when books are, I can't see them, I don't think on the screen, but I have, EOS, Traction, E-Myth
Yeah.
Revisited, like those books really do, I think, a really good job explaining that methodology and kind of what I learned during my process and building this book too is that our methodology mirrored a lot of that. I took bits and pieces from that methodology, but I really do believe in the power of journey focused and staying aligned to like we're trying to build the best version of our company. We're not out here thinking about like we have to have, this crazy outcome and we need to be $1 billion unicorn. It's like not about that. And I think that is a really powerful perspective to have. So we were
Mm.
fortunate, I think, and Chris was very much, not chasing shiny objects too soon. Like we had a competitor, SatDocs, that raised a bunch of capital. I had a similar idea like 2012. It's like, oh, we should take our technology and let title companies self-manage the process. Chris was like, no, we need to like be a real business. You just made the leap full time. What are we doing here? And
Yeah.
sure enough, 6 years later, SatDocs had gone through Y Combinator. At this point, they've pivoted and they have some crazy valuation because they're doing a lot more digital closings than we ever did. But they kind of forced our hand. In 2018, we had to build a solution. So we took our existing platform that we already had and sort of expanded on it. It's sync that companies could then use to self-manage the technology. But I think
Hmm.
that laser focus in the moment was what we needed. And it was very process oriented and very journey oriented and not outcomes and goals come from the process. So I
For
think we
sure.
were fortunate.
I think there's a balance between inputs and outputs, right? Outputs, results. You're not going to directly control that, but you can control your effort and the strategies you deploy that are going to help influence those outputs. So, we've talked a little bit about the book. We've foreshadowed that there's some influence from EOS and other methodologies for entrepreneurs. Can you talk to us about the new book that you've just released? I know it reflects on how you scale the Signature Closers company and lessons that you learned from managing that enormous operational volume. So, tell me what's the core framework from the book that you believe most entrepreneurs misunderstand when it comes to scaling a business, or what do we really need to know about the book?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. It was funny to go on that journey. I enjoyed the creative process. I think my initial thought from the book, I've been telling people recently, I'm like, I've owned accelerate smallbusiness.com for 5 years at least, right? Like I have this in my mind. How do I help small, medium businesses? And I think it's still evolving, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of that too. I want to foreshadow everything before we get to it. But the book kind of came as a result of looking at, I talked to a few people that had written books and had used them as just materials to provide to people to sort of like give them a lens to their way of thinking.
Hmm.
And in this case, for us, I thought we were pretty unique. And the feedback I got from people was like, you should think about this because managing our peak, we managed, over 60,000 real estate transactions on a monthly basis. And we only had like 30 something people. We're bootstrapped. We didn't raise capital. And so that kind of volume is very rare, I think, for a business like ours. I think in general, if you're a consumer brand, Netflix or Uber or something, like you're dealing with thousands and thousands of transactions or millions in their cases. For us to be able to figure out and build a process around, well, how the heck do we manage 62,000 closings in a month? How do we pay these notaries? I mean, we would 1099 5,500 notaries a year. And if you've ever 1099 people, like there's a verification process at that level. It has to be electronically filed. It's a whole process, right? And like receiving payment on that amount of closings. Like some people wanted to pay us with a single check. Some people wanted to pay us, with ACH, with wire. Like there was just so much to learn throughout that process that as I reflected on it, I'm like, I think there's a methodology that we sort of adopted. And early in my career, E-Myth Revisited was a really powerful book for me. My boss at a company called Accelerated Benefits had introduced it to me. And, the stories about this baker essentially that, she gets into business because she loves to bake. And she doesn't have the time or the experience in finance and ops and all the things that you need to run a
Sure.
business. And I was fortunate. I had kind of this wealth of experience because I was, kind of sidetracked through my career there, but I was in the employee benefit space where I saw firsthand companies that had two people, companies that had thousands of people that were clients of ours. And I could see kind of what worked and what didn't in their ops. And so that was really good experience. I was a finance major. I had the background in working with Tom Wagner was instrumental to me early in my career. Sales guru, just somebody that I learned a lot from in that space. There were just all these experiences that blended together that when I looked back, in the moment, I don't think we knew we were doing what we were doing at Signature. And then of course, Chris, I didn't mention him, but like Chris and his process driven orientation and the fact we were at a business process automation company together and like just again all these different things that kind of blended together led us down this path where it was like, oh, there's a process. And I think the takeaway, if you're a small business, the goal of the book, really the first couple chapters talk about why businesses tend to get stuck. So just our inclination to be risk averse. There's studies, Tursky and the other the name of the gentleman and the people that did the study, but risk aversion theory, basically, where we're more inclined to take risk, to avoid loss than we are to gain. And so a lot of businesses get to a place where they're like status quo. We just want to stay where we're at because not because they don't want to grow. A lot of them will say they want to grow, but I think a lot of times it is, it's scary. It's like a risk, right? Like I think of my time at Signature, like there was a point, I think I referenced this in the book where, I initially, when I made the leap, I think I was on, like maybe a six-figure salary, like whatever I was doing, made the leap full time, paid myself 30 or 40, I think it's $40,000 I paid myself for a while. And that's very scary when you have a young family and like, couldn't really live off that for very long. But making that leap, I had to make that leap then again. So like we grew to a point where, okay, cool, like the business is doing well. It's kicking off enough distributions that I'm maybe making back to close to what I was making before. I'm like, crap, I'm doing everything. Like I gotta figure out then like I gotta hire people. And I really labored over that decision. And I think it comes back to just that status quo, that risk of loss. And so it really does, I think, for most businesses take a dedicated, legit choice to say, I'm going to grow. And I know that that means maybe taking a step or two back to then move forward. So that's kind of the beginning of the book. And then the remainder of the book is really about the framework that we build out, which is, it pulls from a lot of resources. Like I'm a big, like Jim Collins. So like it talks a little bit about your hedgehog and, basically the inner compass is what we deemed it, or the base camp. And it's like who, what, where, when, why, and how. Like identifying those questions for a business is critical because most businesses don't take the time to answer them. So, who are our customers? Who's ideal? Who do we want as our customer? What is it that we do and why is it different than what other people offer? Why do I do this in the first place? If I own this business, am I trying to sell it? Am I trying to have a lifestyle business? Like, what am I trying to accomplish with that business? So you go through that methodology. How is really about the customer journey. That's another area I think a lot of small businesses don't think a lot about. And it's not necessarily because they don't have an interest in it. And I think they generally know like this is our process with our customers, but they don't have time. And really to reflect on that, I think is really critical because that's how you find what I would call like bottlenecks or artificial barriers to growth. So the whole idea is you set your establish, your base camp, your why, your what, all the foundation of your business. The next part is really about if you're thinking about growth, you can go about it in a systemic way. A lot of businesses just shoot by it and say, "Ah, we're going to try to grow, and here's how we're going to do it." And they really don't think about, is there data I can use to inform this? Is there a process I can do it through?
Yeah.
So it lays that out. And then, then I talked about like the bottlenecks, or we call it the bottleneck blueprint. It's essentially a barrier to growth. So like if you're trying to grow, if you're trying to improve your business, you need a process to sort of document what are the things that are getting in the way. And then the next step is called SOP builder, so standard operating procedure. And that's essentially building the solution to the roadblock. So, it's like build a foundation, think about how we want to grow, identify things that can get in the way, build a plan to solve those, monitor, and then also have a continuous improvement log on the back end where, that's something we built at Signature where our team, it got to the point where there was like, one of our core values was innovative, interdependent, and a lot of that was pushing for like a continual improvement mindset, not like a 1,000,000% leap, but 1% better. How do we get 1% better? And so, James Clear, Atomic Habits sort of references that. That's a book that I reference in my book, but I love that mentality. And I think if you can build a culture where you're looking for incremental little improvements. How do you like remove a click from this process, which is meaningless typically, but if you have 60,000 transactions, it's actually very powerful. So that's kind of the methodology behind it. It's really about that mindset and that framework to create sort of this, it's like a cycle, basically just sort of build a cycle for your business that it's like kind of in a continuous improvement mindset, but built into a framework. So that's kind of what the book's about. And then of course, the last chapter is about my experience on the company, which like I said was wild. So there's some interesting takes from that and just for your business, customer concentration and things that come up for you that are important. Like if you're the owner and you are the business, that's not good. Like you need to find a way to get yourself out of that seat a little bit and create process around it and documentation and data. You can sell a business when you are the business, but it's a lot harder. You're probably going to be there a lot longer. So there's just things like that I shared.
That's great. And it's called the Holy Grail of Scale, right?
It is.
And it's available on Amazon. Where's the best place to buy it, do you think, or does it not matter?
Probably Amazon. I mean, you can get it through the online catalogs. So if you go to a local bookstore, I'm all about local. So like here in Columbus, like Storyline's an amazing bookstore. So if you can support, Storyline, do that, right? But if you're looking to get it quickly, you can also get it through Kindle, through Amazon as well.
Cool. I'm excited for it. I'm 18 months into being an entrepreneur, and I think about what you just said. And it's a question that I asked earlier, which is like, oh, wasn't this like a oh crap moment? What do I do? Like when you 10x your business in a month or two, whatever it ended up being at the holidays. And everybody does have a variance in what level of risk they're, open to or willing to take on. And I do feel like very early on, I was very narrow focused, and this is how I'm going to get business. I'm going to go to conferences and I'm going to meet everybody. I'm going to build relationships and it's going to drive this revenue. I spent 40 grand on travel in my first year in business.
Yeah.
I got one client from a conference. I spent $1,500 on LinkedIn and I got 4 clients. 65% of my revenue last year was from $1,500, and like 7% of my revenue was based on that 40K. But I had to try, right? Like an entrepreneur, you
Yeah.
have to try. Like, so my initial strategy was not the winning strategy, and LinkedIn's not like the only thing I'll ever do, but it reminded me, like, your first instinct on what's going to work isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not necessarily right today or always going to be right. And I think
Hmm.
that's like the fun part of entrepreneurship. So I am excited for the book. It's already in my cart on Amazon. I should have read it before we got on here, but I wanted to get you on as close to your launch as possible. So,
Yeah.
um, speaking of
Appreciate
launch,
it.
this is not your only thing that you're launching in 2026. You also just started the new venture, The Arena, designed to create an ecosystem for entrepreneurs like me and like you in a past life to access technology, resources, and expertise. I can tell you've got a heart for entrepreneurs. What problems are you solving for founders with The Arena?
It's funny. I mean, you mentioned like the things you've tried and how things have evolved. So the book, was a reflection on the methodology, and a few folks I'd spoken with were like, yeah, you should really kind of like provide that as a guide. And it's also, a nice like lead magnet or marketing material to give to people to say, hey, this is sort of how we think about things. So I think initially my plan was, okay, I'll launch this book, maybe we'll do some workshops, tied to that to help people implement the methodology. Because I think, if you read the book or if you get into the methodology, there's definitely a lot of overlap with EOS.
Mm-hmm.
There's some differences, but there's a lot of overlap to the point where, like, I think you would see a lot of similarities. Like, you can kind of run EOS through this methodology. And so initially, that was kind of my plan. I'll have the workshops, and then, within Arena, we're going to offer audits. So if you go to our site today, there's 4 partners, including myself, where we would offer a business an audit in kind of 4 critical areas. So sales and marketing, ops and technology, due diligence and general strategy, and then finance and accounting. So what
Mm-hmm.
that looks like is, probably an hour initial meeting between one of us, one of the subject matter experts, and that business owner or leadership team. We'll circle back with questions, whether that's a survey or other things that we need to gather information, and then we'll put together sort of a roadmap, essentially to say, hey, like, this is where you are today. Here's where we think you could be. That's a service we'll offer. And then also there's, some preparation if people are trying to sell their business. So there's sort of this like bevy of services. And to your earlier point, book's only been out for, it's not been too long. Initially it's like, oh, okay, I'll launch the book. That'll be the lead magnet. That'll be how I have conversations. And that's happened a little, but I've had to pivot. And I've also pivoted a little in the sense that the workshops, what I found is that, with the advancements in technology, I had it in the back of my mind that I would want to create a digitized version of the workshops eventually anyways,
Yeah.
but I've been able to do that much, much faster. So the last like 5 or 6 weeks, I've actually been building out a platform called the Arena Ops Hub that the idea is how do we help a business that wants to implement, a better process, almost an EOS-like process,
Mm-hmm.
use data, and sort of aggregate it all in one place. So it's still an ongoing development, but that's sort of the emphasis of Arena. And it pulls together like not only these resources, whether it's, the audits or the platform, which is like in its beta version. So it's free. So if you're listening and you want to use it, check it out. Yeah, I think it'll be helpful and happy to help implement it. But also
Wait,
then there's other, good.
when you say check it out, where are they checking out? Where do we want them to go?
Mm. So you can just go to the website. It's just www.wearearena.com. And there's a tab on there that has like the Arena Ops Hub as well as the other things we do.
Cool.
And you'll see also there's Arena operating partners. So Julia, you're one and among others. And the goal there is really to bring resources and expertise to people that are in need of that expertise. And, the bench that I wish I had when I was in that position, because, you're so busy in the day to day, you don't really know where to turn. And this is a group of people that we've been building that is, I think a pretty strong group of people that have gone through exits, have built businesses, have a vast array of experience. When I was thinking about the transition and how complicated it was to sell a business and then also just to
Yeah.
be there and integrate it for 3 years. I think of you, Julie. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, we wish I'd known you back then because holy cow, like transitioning my business into Stewart's infrastructure, our 30 people into this behemoth Fortune 800 company, it's like AR and AP, we had technology, like the list is endless. HR, all of that is such a heavy lift. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you're somebody that's in a position that's going through that, like to have somebody like you on a team would be incredibly valuable. You're one example of a few that
Yeah.
I mentioned at the Arena group, but that's kind of the goal. It's like, how do we sort of pay it forward, provide a resource to people that can kind of help them, and I think the ops side, I'm excited because it's a way to do that at scale. Whereas I think my biggest concern with the workshops is I'm like, I can only do so much. So it's like, how do I expand the potential to
Hmm.
help people and try? And right now, what I'm really focused on is how do I build it in such a way that it can be almost self-serving, so that people can use it and use the methodology. And if they want a coach or they want expertise, they can pull us in. But that's sort of the goal. So yeah, that's the brand that's launching kind of with the book.
What I like so much about the channel partnership is I recognize that my skill set with M&A integration is very niche. I don't know, whatever, however you say it, however the listener says it, that's how you should hear it. And it's kind of like a moment in time utility player, right?
Hmm.
And I think for entrepreneurs, as they're like small, medium, growing, scaling, selling, whatever, there are moments in time where you have a very specific need and it might be hard for you to find the solution to your need. But I think the arena helps to bridge that gap, right? Where people can come and they can find out, entrepreneurs can see and learn from the workshops, from the audits, get partnered with or have opportunities to meet with subject matter experts for the moment that they need it without taking on massive overhead expense or labor expense for something that's not a sustained need. So that's something that really excites me about the arena.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's kind of the goal is like when I think about my journey, there might have been some things that would be necessary for the entirety of the journey, but there's also, like you said, moments in time where there's a specific need. And I will say, like, and I'm biased, right? Because we're starting this business, it's the arena, and we want
Yeah.
people to check it out. But I also believe that there's something to be said for the experience of going through something. So, like, as you're dealing with or working with folks, I think one of the advantages and one of the things that we've tried to build is people that have been there, done that, whether that's been in entrepreneurship roles, whether that's been in M&A, like yourself, Julia, as well as kind of entrepreneurship. You've done a little bit of both, but like the idea is, somebody who's been in your shoes can save you a lot of time and a lot of money. So
Mhm.
knowing that, I think it's like, okay, you can go through and you can try this and it's going to cost you, 6 months and a bunch of money, or we can sort of help you streamline that process. Cause like I stubbed my toe 20 times doing this and here's how I would do it differently. And I think there really is value in that. And, within the arena, it's like we want to have people that are advisory as well as kind of hands on. So,
Mhm.
like if somebody's listening and it's like, oh man, I feel like my sales is stuck. Like, okay, cool. Like Scott Leese is a partner and he's an incredible partner. He can come in and build that stuff out for you. I'll step in and kind of help for a period of time. Like there are people and opportunities, I think, to pull people in for a set period of time to solve a problem or to really get to the root cause of whatever you're struggling with. And I mean, to me, that would have been hugely instrumental. I mean, most of what I found, like at Signature, even as we grew, it was like, it's like, oh my God, I have this problem. I just like start getting on the internet,
Yeah.
Googling and
Googling
it would
like
have been great.
HBR. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like what do I do? Like, how do can I pay notaries electronically? The world's changing so fast in the I guess 2008 to 2020 or whatever. Like, so much changed
Yeah.
that, it was a little bit of a challenge because I was busy running the businesses were growing, let alone trying to solve the problems. I think just having somebody in your corner that can be like, oh, I've lived through that. Here's, here's my story. Here's how I can help you. I think that's beneficial. The business, the idea of Arena is really just how do we support that ecosystem.
I have another question, Mark. I want to know how you came up with the name The Arena.
I it's a great question. I think my wife introduced me to the man in the arena, and the whole idea of daring greatly, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as I reflected on kind of the entrepreneurial journey and kind of what I was building, there's something that stuck with me. Like, so she was a business owner. She owned a fitness studio through COVID, which was, obviously very difficult. And we talked a lot about just like being in the arena, right? Like,
Hmm.
it's if you're in the arena and you're putting in the effort and you're showing up, that's really what matters. And ultimately, it kind of comes back to even thinking about like the journey and being journey focused.
Yep.
But, I'm a big, I don't know, like Brene Brown and Adam Grant and people that are, in that space and that way of thinking. And I think there's something to the effect that, something that they talk about that listening to people that are in the arena and taking advice from them is one thing. And then there's people that are in like the cheap seats, as we would say,
Yeah.
and not letting those people tear you down. And that's a really valuable thing as an entrepreneur, because I can tell you, like, I mean, I had multiple points, like, probably things motivated me that shouldn't have, or like, well, I let that motivate me too much. Maybe that's part of the blessing and the curse of being an entrepreneur. But I can remember people saying, well, if you make that leap, you're just going to be this little tiny business and you could be over here doing this. Or, there were conversations I continually remember that were motivating to me. But then when I, kind of matured and got older, I look back and I'm like, was that person in the arena or not? If they weren't,
Uh-huh.
their advice really doesn't matter to me. So that's kind of how we landed. I think it's a good metaphor for what people experience that run a business. And if you've been in entrepreneurship, you understand probably pretty quickly what that means.
It's funny you say this because anything that's difficult in life, you get the opinions from the people in the cheap seats who've never done it, and it's usually very cautious, very much like, I remember I ran a marathon and my dad was like, "Oh, you're going to get hurt." And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "Shut up. I'm not talking to you about this until after it's over. Like, you can come see me run, see me at the finish line. I'm fine." You talk to people who are marathon runners and they're like, "This is going to be great. Here's exactly what you need to do in order to run it, like, and run it well and not get hurt. Make sure you're cross training, make sure you're working on your core." Like, it's just different feedback that you get. And I was actually hoping that you would say this because my youngest son is named Teddy after Theodore Roosevelt. And this quote, I think, goes originally to Theodore Roosevelt, or at least that's how it was first introduced to me. So I
Yep.
had it pulled up just in case that was coming. So I'm going to read it for the listeners. "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." Ooh, it's so strong.
It's a good quote. Now, of course, the TikTok trend came out that's like, what's your Roman Empire? And I'm like, oh man, I struggled with the arena and, what to do with the brands. But I was like, I think, yeah, like for what it's worth, I understand the negative connotations, the implications that can come from it too. But I was like, I think in this case, as an entrepreneur, I really liked it. And I'd already gone down the path of building it out. But that quote really does kind of hit the nail on the head, I think, about entrepreneurship and also, other areas of life. But like, I think it applies to really well to business. Just, entrepreneurship is a risk and you're taking a leap and there's no guarantees, but it's also very rewarding. And I think it should be celebrated when people take the leap, whether it works or not, because I would be the first to say, like, yeah, I think we made some great decisions and we're opportunistic, but we were lucky too. And like, I think that's part of the deal is that, I'm not going to sit here and say, man, we were just so much smarter and better and
Mhm.
whatever. Like, it very easily could have failed. And that's just the way it goes sometimes when you're in entrepreneurship. And we got fortunate. So that's part of the motivation behind Arena too, is to figure out how to pay that forward to somebody else and say, all right, yeah, we got a little lucky. Well, how can we help you get a little lucky? What's that look
Mhm.
like? And, there are things you can do to increase your chances. That's how I look at it. So,
For sure. Well, and you've bootstrapped, scaled, exited, invested. Now your focus is shifted to helping other businesses grow. If you could give just one piece of advice to an entrepreneur building their first company today, what would it be?
well, I think, of course, that's such a good question, also a loaded question, right?
Join
Because
the
I guess,
arena.
yeah, hire us. No, I would say it really depends on where they are, right? So if you're like just starting out, you had mentioned in the intro, like talent share, right? So I started that business a little bit after we had sold Signature Closers. One of my good friends was the pitching coach at Ohio State. And he's like, oh, I got a pitcher that, he's bussing tables at say he should be doing pitching lessons, but he has no idea where to start. Like when I was at Ohio
Yeah.
State, I made a bunch of money doing pitching lessons. I was like, oh, we can solve that. We'll build an app. We'll connect parents to coach or to collegiate athletes. And we'll have some lessons. Like it'll be amazing. And I think what we didn't realize, what I didn't do is enough market research to really know my customers. So I would say like in the earliest stages, get to know
Mhm.
your customer and lean into that feedback, and I think I've heard this and I forget, I don't know who to attribute it to. I've seen it in I think James Clear's newsletters and others, but I don't think it's his quote originally. Talks a lot about basically if you're making a decision that can be easily reversed, move quickly. But if it's
Mhm.
a decision that's going to be very impactful for the long term, then take your time. And
Mhm.
I think that advice translates across, business in general and across any stage for these entrepreneurs, especially the early stage though. Like it's important to move quickly, build your MVP, learn, change, grow. Don't just assume you knew. We assumed we
Right.
knew talent share didn't work out. So two reasons for that. But a big one I think was not staying close to our customers at the beginning and really validating the idea. And then as you get further along, I think it comes down to ultimately like taking the time to understand what you want because
Mm.
like a lot of businesses say they want to grow, but when you start to reflect on what that means to grow, like there's some growing pains. And so it's good and it's bad. And you have to be willing to kind of say, yeah, I'm willing to take that chance, or I'm willing to kind of move away from the status quo. But it should align with why. Because like if you have a lifestyle business and you're making a great living, paying your bills, and you're working a balanced life and you're happy, I wouldn't tell, like, if that's what you want, then I wouldn't necessarily think about, oh, I need to like get to the next level or grow. It's like, how do I keep this thing humming along and going at the pace it's going? So, to me, I think it really comes back to taking the time to understand, those 5, 6 initial questions and building that foundation. And then once you decide that, then you can start to think about, okay, like, what is my goal? Do I want to grow? What do I want out of this business? And why am I doing what I do? I think that's really powerful because until you do that, you're kind of like, I mean, for Signature for a long time, that's like what we were doing, just sort of, yeah, we're in the cycle and it's going great, but there wasn't a lot of like motivation or focus behind what's our ultimate end goal. And I think the last 2 to 3 years we owned the business, it started to like firm up based on,
Mhm.
it's kind of forced on me. But I think if you're an entrepreneur, the earlier you can get to that stage where you really understand yourself and your motivation, get to know yourself, the better it is for you.
It's so interesting too because our journeys are kind of opposite to entrepreneurship. I mean, you got the lay of the land very, very young in the notary
Hmm.
space. And like you had mentioned, you were a finance major, you had a sales mentor, like you had worked in operations. You didn't quit your day job before the business was viable, right?
Right.
And that was the exact opposite of what I did. And so like your first attempt at entrepreneurship was successful. I mean, maybe I don't know if you had like a lawn cutting business when you were a kid or something, but like I'm gonna call this your first
First
attempt
real,
at.
but yeah. Yeah.
For me, I worked as a loan officer for Quicken Loans, now Rocket, and I got so burnt out that I just literally quit my job, making lots of money at the time as like a 23, 24-year-old, and started an Etsy business selling handmade wreaths, not
Hmm.
having a clue again about the market demand for that or like the profit margin and time and materials or anything about business. So that lasted like 3 months, and then I went back into mortgage sales and got a job, a real job. And so like for a while, I probably from like 2012 to like 2018, 2019, I was like, okay, well, I'm not good at being an entrepreneur because that didn't work. And that was
Hmm.
such a fixed mindset. It was so limiting. It was so limiting, Mark. And then I was like, well, I want to buy a couple rental properties. And I talked to a friend, and it was because I was refinancing all 9 of his rental properties.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, tell me about this because this actually looks viable. How do you do it? And
Right.
he's like, again, come on in. The water's fine, right? Because he's already
Right.
there. So I bought a rental property in 2019, bought 4 more, had some Airbnbs, some long-term rentals, and it was
Hmm.
all working. Like the demand was insane. It just all worked. The profit margin was great. And I was like, wow, I'm not a bad entrepreneur. I was not well equipped back then. Like I should have been
Hmm.
in the arena then to
Hmm.
recognize that this wasn't going to work. But it was like right place, right time, right industry, right skill set. And then I had the confidence then built up from the rental properties and the Airbnbs, to really like believe that I could go out as an entrepreneur full boat. And I think that there's like a lot that goes into mindset. So if you're an entrepreneur listening to this today who started with a failure, that doesn't mean you can't be successful in the future. Or maybe you started with a success and then you failed, you can be successful again, right? Like nothing's set in stone here.
It's all part of the journey. I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head that, whether your first venture worked or not, there's a lot to learn. And I think
Mhm.
that's, as long as you're using it as a learning tool and then taking away, okay, like where could I be better? I mean, a big
Mhm.
key too, and I know you didn't ask for multiple pieces of advice, but I think surrounding yourself with people that are, that are better than you in a lot of areas, like that's a really important jump to make. And it's scary, like as far as delegating. I mean, I remember at Signature, part of the reason I held on so tightly is I'm like, oh, like I care more than anybody, which is probably true for hopefully most entrepreneurs. And, nobody's going to care as much as the owner. I think that's probably true everywhere. But ultimately, you have to be able to train people, to trust them, and to get to a place where I can be hands off because you can't grow otherwise. Like you have to be
Right.
able to get out of the touching every single thing in the business, or you're like Sarah the baker and E-Myth, right? You're doing everything, and you don't have the time or capacity to work. They say work in the business or work on the business, and
Mhm.
working on the business is a very underrated but necessary piece to growing business. So I think, yeah, it's good advice.
All right, Mark. Well, this has been a great conversation. From building signature closers to investing through MEMM Capital and launching the arena, it's clear you're continuing to push the conversation around entrepreneurship and scaling business. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great.